Nobody in Coldwater, Kansas, would bid on the woman in the brown dress, and the longer the silence held, the worse it got for everyone in it. It was a Saturday in late September of 1879, and the matrimonial agent had set up his platform of nailed-together crates outside the freight office, the way he did in a dozen towns a season. He was a fat man named Pruitt, with a watch chain and a salesman's grin, and he had brought 4 women west from St. Louis, each one hoping to find a husband faster than a husband could be found the slow way. 3 of them had gone in the first hour, a pretty seamstress to the blacksmith, a widow with a child to the man who ran the livery, a round, laughing girl to a sheep farmer who could not stop smiling. The 4th woman was older than the others, or looked it. She was tall and plain, and stood very straight, and the left side of her face, from the cheekbone down to the jaw, was marked with the old silvered scarring of a bad burn. She wore a brown dress, clean and mended, and she kept her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes level on the middle distance, and she did not flinch when Pruitt called for bids, and the crowd answered with nothing at all. "Come now, gentlemen," Pruitt said, the grin going strained. "A strong, healthy woman, sound and sensible, keeps a clean house. Who'll start us at $5? Nothing. 3 then. $3 for a lifetime partner." A man near the front laughed, not kindly. Somebody muttered something about the face, loud enough to carry. The woman in the brown dress heard it. You could tell she heard it by the way nothing on her moved at all, which is the way a person holds still when holding still is the only dignity left to hold. $2, Pruitt said, and the word came out thin, because $2 was an insult, and everyone standing there knew it. "Will no man give me $2? And that was when Amos Kerr, who had come to town for a sack of nails and a barrel of flour and absolutely nothing else, heard his own voice say, "I'll give 2. He did not entirely know why he said it. He would spend a good part of the winter figuring that out. He was 38, a quiet man with a quarter section north of the creek and a dog and not much else. And he had not come looking for a wife and had no business buying one for the price of a bad meal. But he had watched the woman stand there and take it, the laughing and the muttering and the long, ugly silence, and something in him had simply refused to let the silence be the last thing that happened to her. The crowd turned to look at him. Pruitt's grin came roaring back. "Sold," he said, before Amos could think better of it, "to the gentleman with the flower, for $2. The woman in the brown dress turned her level eyes on Amos Kerr for the first time. There was no gratitude in them. There was something harder and more interesting than gratitude. There was a question, and the question was, "And what do you think you've bought, exactly?" He would not have a good answer for months. By the time he did, half the people laughing in that crowd would owe this woman their children's lives, and not one of them would be laughing. He paid Pruitt the $2 in silver, and it felt obscene in his hand, and he was glad to be rid of it. There were papers. That surprised him. Pruitt produced a printed agreement, a marriage contract of the rough frontier kind, and a small Bible to swear on, and a circuit clerk who happened to be in town and would, for an additional 50 cents, make the thing legal on the spot. Amos had not planned on getting married behind a freight office on a Saturday, but the woman was watching him, and he understood that to back out now, after the bid, after the crowd, would be a crueler thing than the bid itself. "You don't have to," the woman said quietly, while the clerk dipped his pen. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice was low and even, and carried more education than her brown dress did. "You made your point. You can pay Mr. Pruitt his $2 and walk away, and I'll think well of you for the rest of my life. Nobody would blame you." "Do you want me to walk away?" Amos asked. She considered that with the same level honesty she did everything. "No," she said. "I have 11 cents and no people, and a face that costs me every door I knock on. I would rather take my chances on a man who bid when no one else would, than go back to St. Louis on Mr. Pruitt's wagon. But I won't have you do it out of pity. Pity curdles. I've seen it curdle in better men than you look to be." "It's not pity," Amos said, and was a little surprised to find it was true. "I don't rightly know what it is, but it's not that." So they signed. Her name, in a clean, strong hand, far better than his own scrawl, was Ruth Adair. The clerk pronounced them married. The crowd had mostly drifted off to better entertainments, and the few who remained watched the tall, scarred woman climb up onto the plain rancher's wagon beside the flour and the nails, and shook their heads at the strangeness of it, and went home to tell their wives. Amos clucked to the horses. Ruth Adair sat straight-backed beside him, hands folded, and watched Coldwater fall away behind them. "I should tell you," she said, when the town was a mile gone, "that I'm not the bargain you think you got. I expect you'll find out soon enough, so you may as well hear it from me. All right? I'm a nurse," she said. "Trained. I worked 4 years in a hospital in St. Louis, and 2 more before that with an army surgeon's widow, who taught me more than the hospital did. The burn on my face came from a ward fire I walked into to carry out 2 children who'd have died otherwise. I carried them out. I've never once been sorry about the fire, only about what it did to my prospects." She paused. "So you didn't buy a plain woman who keeps a clean house. You bought a woman who knows how to keep people alive. I don't know if that's worth more to you or less, but it's the truth, and I'll always give you the truth, whether or not you want it." Amos Kerr drove on a while in silence, turning that over. Then he said the only thing that seemed honest. "Mrs. Kerr, I think I got the better end of that $2 than anybody in Coldwater is going to believe." His place was small and clean, in the way a careful single man keeps a place, which is to say clean in the corners that show, and neglected in the ones that do not. Ruth Adair walked through it once, slowly, taking inventory with a nurse's eye, and Amos saw it through her gaze and was embarrassed by half of it. "The well," she said. "How close to the privy?" 40 feet, maybe. Move the privy or move the well before spring. 40 feet is how you poison yourself slow and call it bad luck." She said it without heat, the way she said everything, a fact laid down for use. "Where do you keep the sick when the sick come? Because they will come. They always come. Nobody's been sick out here but me, and I just sweat it out." "You've been lucky," Ruth said. "Luck is a thing that gets spent." She took the small room off the kitchen for herself, and Amos kept the loft, and there was no awkwardness about it because Ruth Adair did not allow room for awkwardness. She simply decided how things would be, and they were that way. And Amos found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind being organized. His mother had run things once, before she passed, and the house had felt like a home then. It had not felt like one in a long while. It started to again. She was not warm. He noticed that and made his peace with it. She did not laugh much, and did not chatter, and did not soften the hard edges of what she said. But she was fair, and she was tireless, and within a week she had the root cellar reorganized, and the well-being dug fresh on the high ground, and a list of herbs she wanted to grow come spring, and Amos's quiet dog, who trusted nobody, had taken to sleeping across her door. A dog knows things. Amos had learned to trust the dog. The first weeks were a careful kind of quiet. 2 strangers who had married behind a freight office do not become easy with each other overnight, and they did not pretend to. Ruth kept her own room and her own counsel. Amos kept to the work and gave her room to find her feet. But small things began to stack up the way small things do. He noticed she took her coffee black and strong and started making it that way without asking. She noticed he favored his right knee in the cold and quietly built a thicker cushion into the chair by the stove. Neither of them said a word about either. That was how it went between them at first. A kindness done and not mentioned. An understanding built one unspoken thing at a time. One evening in the second week a hard rain came through, and the roof over the kitchen sprang a leak it had sprung for 3 years. Amos got up to put the old pot under it. Same as always. Ruth watched him a moment, then said, "Or you could fix the flashing in the morning and be done with it for good, instead of dancing with that pot every storm for the rest of your life." She said it dry, with the ghost of something that was almost humor in it. Amos looked at the pot and at the woman and laughed out loud for the first time since the freight office. A short, surprised bark of a laugh. He fixed the flashing in the morning. The pot went back on its shelf and stayed there. It was a small thing. It did not feel small. Coldwater did not let it go. Towns rarely do. When Amos brought Ruth in for supplies, conversations dropped to whispers and rose again behind their backs. The $2 bride, that was what they called her, when they thought she could not hear, and sometimes when they knew she could. Children stared at the burn. The Coldwater women, who set the temperature of any small place, drew their skirts in a little when she passed, as though plainness and a scarred face and a humiliation behind the freight office were things that might rub off. The hardest of them was Mrs. Dorothea Vance, the banker's wife, who ran the church committee and the social calendar and the unwritten law of who was respectable. She made a point, in the Mercantile, of speaking about Ruth in the third person, while Ruth stood 4 feet away choosing thread. "Some women," Mrs. Vance said to her companion, "will sell themselves for any roof. In my day, a woman had standards, and if she couldn't get a husband honestly, she did without." Ruth Adair set down her thread. She did not raise her voice. "In your day, ma'am, I expect a great many women did without a great many things, and called it virtue because they had no other word for the lack." She picked the thread back up. "I'll take 3 spools of this, Mr. Hobb, and a paper of needles. My husband and I have a long winter to sew through." "My husband," she said it plainly, claiming it, and Amos, 2 aisles over pretending to study a harness, felt something turn over in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Mrs. Vance went red and said something about the impudence of certain people. But the seed was planted, and seeds grow whether the gardener likes them or not. 2 women in the Mercantile that day went home and thought, privately, that the $2 bride had more spine than the banker's wife, and said nothing, and remembered. The sickness started in October with a child. It was the Hobb boy, the storekeeper's youngest, 6 years old. A sore throat first, then a fever, then a cough with a sound in it that the Coldwater doctor, an aging man named Pierce who drank more than he doctored, called a bad croup and treated with a syrup and a shrug. Within 4 days the boy could barely breathe, and a gray membrane had grown across the back of his throat, and old Doc Pierce ran out of confidence and syrup at about the same time. Ruth Adair heard about it at the Mercantile from the boy's terrified mother, who in her fear forgot to be too proud to talk to the $2 bride. Ruth asked 3 questions. What color is the membrane? Can he swallow water? Are there other children in the house? When she had the answers, her level face went, for the first time Amos had seen, truly grim. "That's not croup," she said. "That's diphtheria. And if it's in the Hobb house with 3 other children, it is already in this town, and it will be in a dozen houses inside 2 weeks, unless somebody who knows what they're doing takes hold of it tonight." "Doc Pierce," the mother began. "Doc Pierce is a kind man who has not opened a medical book since the war," Ruth said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Hobb, I worked a diphtheria ward in St. Louis through 2 winters. I am the only person within 40 miles who has seen this disease do its worst and learned how to fight it. I am also the woman this town paid $2 for and has not let forget it. So I will ask you plainly, because there is no time for anything but plain. Do you want my help, or do you want your pride? Because tonight, you cannot keep both." Mrs. Hobb, who had a child the color of ash at home, chose her child. There is a real quote I have carried with me a long time, from Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross and saw more sickness and ruin than most. "I may be compelled to face danger," she said, "but never fear it." I thought of that line the first time I heard this story, because Ruth Adair walked into the Hobb house that night knowing exactly what was loose in Coldwater, and walked in anyway. She took charge the way only a person who truly knows a thing can. She had the sick children moved out of the crowded houses and into the church, which was large and could be aired and scrubbed. She drew a hard line down the middle of the town, the sick on one side, the well on the other, and woe to anyone who crossed it without her say. She boiled everything. She burned the rags. She taught a dozen frightened mothers to wash their hands in scalding water until they cracked, and to do it again and again, because the disease traveled on hands and breath and she meant to cut its roads. She was awake for most of 3 days. Amos drove her between the church and the outlying farms, and hauled water, and dug a second pit for the burning, and did whatever the tall, scarred woman told him to do without question, because it was plain to him, and getting plain to others, that she was the one thing standing between Coldwater and a row of small graves. Old Doc Pierce, to his credit, sobered up and stood down. "I treated the croup I knew," he told Amos quietly, And your wife's treating the diphtheria, I forgot. She's right and I'm wrong. And I'm too old to be proud about it. Tell her I'll fetch and carry and keep my mouth shut. Tell her she's the doctor this week. Mrs. Vance's youngest daughter took sick on the 5th day. The banker's wife, who had spoken about Ruth in the 3rd person while Ruth stood 4 feet away, came to the church door at midnight with her child in her arms and her pride in pieces. Ruth Adair did not say a single word about the mercantile. She took the child and she looked at the throat and she said, "We caught it early. Help me and she'll live. Stand in my way and I can't promise. Which will it be?" And Dorothea Vance, who had never in her life taken an order from a woman she considered her inferior, rolled up the sleeves of her good dress and did exactly as the $2 bride told her, all that long night and the 6 that followed. It went on for 3 weeks, and it was not clean, and it was not easy, and Ruth Adair did not save everyone. She would have been the first to tell you that. 2 children died in that church, and she sat with each of them at the end so they would not be alone, and then she went and washed her hands in the scalding water and went back to the ones she could still save, because that is the work, and the work does not stop to let you grieve. There was one night that Amos never told anyone about for years, because he did not have the stomach to relive it out loud. The hob boy stopped breathing. The gray membrane had closed his throat near to nothing, and his small chest heaved and got no air, and his lips went the deep blue that means a person has minutes and not many. Doc Pierce stood frozen. The mother screamed, and Ruth Adair, who had laid down facts for use since the day Amos met her, laid down the worst one yet. "His throat's closing," she said, already moving. "If I don't open an airway below it, he dies in this room in the next 2 minutes. I've seen the surgeon do it twice. I've never done it myself. But twice is more than anyone else here has seen, and 2 minutes is all the boy has, so there's no better choice and no time to find one." She looked at the mother. "Hold his hands. Look at his face, not at mine. Talk to him, so he hears your voice and not the room. Amos, the lamp, close and steady, and do not let it shake, no matter what I do." Amos held the lamp. He did not let it shake. He watched the scarred woman take a small clean blade she had boiled twice and make a careful cut at the base of the boy's throat, and slide a short length of boiled reed through it, and put her own mouth to the reed and draw the blockage clear. And then the most beautiful sound Amos Kerr ever heard came out of that reed, which was a 6-year-old boy pulling a full breath of air into his body and crying with the strength to do it. Ruth sat back on her heels, gray to the lips herself, hands steady as stone, and said only, "Now we keep that clean for a week, and he lives." Then she got up and washed her hands in the scalding water and went to the next cot, because the work does not stop. She saved the hob boy, who had been the color of ash, and who came back from it slow and thin and alive, with a small white scar at the base of his throat that he would carry his whole life like a coin he could not spend. She saved the Vance girl. She saved the liveryman's stepson and the sheep farmer's new wife and 11 others, and she kept the disease penned on its side of the line she had drawn until the cold, deep winter finally killed it, the way deep cold eventually kills such things. And all through it, the town watched the woman they had refused to bid on do the one thing none of them could do. They watched her go without sleep. They watched her hold dying children and bury 2, and never once break in front of the living. They watched her husband, the quiet rancher, look at her across the church by lamplight with something on his face that was a great deal more than $2 worth of regard. A town's heart can turn. It turns slow and then, like weather, all at once. By the time the first hard freeze locked the ground, there was not a soul in Coldwater who called Ruth Kerr the $2 bride. There were only people who called her, quietly and then out loud, the woman who had saved their children. The night the last sick child went home well, Amos drove Ruth back to the place north of the creek, under a sky thick with cold stars. She was so tired she swayed on the seat. She had not properly slept in the better part of a month. "You should say it," Ruth said suddenly, eyes closed, head back. "Whatever it is you've been not saying since the freight office. You're a quiet man, and I respect it, but I'm too tired tonight to do the work of guessing, so you'll have to do the work of speaking." Amos drove a while. Then he said, When I bid on you, I told myself it was just to stop the silence, to not let that be the last thing that happened to you in front of all those people. I've thought about it every day since, and I don't think that's the whole of it." He cleared his throat. "I think I looked at you standing there taking the worst the world had, straight-backed, not giving them the satisfaction of a single flinch, and I thought, there is a person who knows how to stand. And I have been standing alone north of that creek for a long time. And I wanted to stand next to somebody who knew how." Ruth opened her eyes and looked at him. "I bought a wife for $2, Amos said. "But that's not what I got, and we both knew it before we cleared the town. I got a partner the equal of any man I ever met, and the better of most. The $2 is the thing I'm most ashamed of, and the best money I ever spent, both at the same time, and I don't expect that'll ever stop being true." For a long moment, Ruth Adair, who did not soften, who laid down facts for use and did not waste words on comfort, said nothing at all. Then she reached over, in the cold and the dark, and put her cracked, scalded, capable hand over his on the reins. "I married you because you bid when no one would," she said. "I'll stay because of what you just said, and because of the man who hauled water for 3 days without being asked, and dug a burning pit so children's mothers wouldn't have to. I am not a warm woman, Amos Kerr. I never learned how, and I'm too old to start now. But I am a loyal one. You'll never once doubt where I am or whose side I'm on. For some people that's worth more than warmth. I hope you're one of them." "I am," said Amos, and he was. Spring came, the way it does, green and impossible. The town that had laughed behind a freight office had become, over one terrible winter, a town that owed a debt it could never quite figure out how to pay. People tried. The Hobbs would not take a cent for supplies at the mercantile and got into a standoff with Amos about it every visit. The sheep farmer drove out a whole side of mutton and would not hear no. Dorothea Vance, of all people, organized the churchwomen to raise a proper sick room onto the back of the meeting hall, a clean, bright space with a stove and cots and shelves. And when it was done, she asked Ruth Kerr, publicly, in front of everyone, to be the one who ran it. "We've no doctor worth the name, and we nearly paid for it in graves," Mrs. Vance said, and it cost her something to say it, and she said it anyway. "You're the closest thing this town has to a healer, Mrs. Kerr, and the best thing, too. We were fools last September. I was the biggest fool of all, and I said things I'd give a good deal to take back. I can't take them back, but I can ask you, in front of God and everybody, to forgive a proud woman, and let us be glad you're ours." Ruth Adair Kerr, with the silvered burn down the left side of her face that had cost her every door until it brought her to the right one, looked at the banker's wife for a long, level moment. "There's nothing to forgive that the winter didn't already settle," she said. "But I'll run your sick room, on 3 conditions. The well gets moved away from every privy in this town before summer. Every child gets looked at by me twice a year whether they're sick or not. And nobody, ever again, decides what a person's worth by looking at their face." She paused. "Those are my terms. They're not negotiable. I learned them the hard way, and so did you." Coldwater agreed to all 3. The well got moved. The children got looked at, and the woman no man would bid on became, within a year, the most respected person in the county, the one they sent for in the deep of the night, the one whose 2 scarred hands had held half the town's children back from the edge. "I will tell you how it ended, because you have come this far and earned it. They were never a soft couple. That was not in either of them. But they were a true one, and in the long run true outlasts soft. Amos moved the privy and dug the high well and grew the herbs Ruth wanted, rows of them, and learned to assist her well enough that the county started calling him the healer's husband, which he wore like a medal. They never had children of their own. By the time they married, that season had likely passed for Ruth, and they did not speak of it much. But there was hardly a child in that part of Kansas who did not, at one time or another, owe their breathing to Ruth Kerr, and a great many of them grew up calling at the house north of the creek just to sit a while with the 2 quiet people who had saved them. And that, Amos used to say, was a fuller house than most. When Ruth died, an old woman, in her own clean, bright sick room, with Amos holding the scarred and capable hand, the whole town came. Not out of duty, out of debt and out of love, which by then had become, In Coldwater, the same thing. They buried her under a stone that the churchwomen paid for without being asked. And the stone did not say $2 bride, and it did not mention the freight office or the laughing crowd. It said only her name and the dates, and underneath, in letters, Dorothea Vance chose herself. She bid on us when we would not bid on her. Amos Kerr paid $2 for the woman no one wanted, on a Saturday in September, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself. By winter, the whole town owed her their lives. And by the end of his own long life, the quiet rancher north of the creek had come to understand the thing the crowd outside that freight office never could, that the worth of a person is not set by the people too small to see it, and that the best bargain a man ever makes is sometimes the one everyone else was too foolish to bid on. If this one moved you, stay with me a while. There are more stories like it out here, more people the world wrote off and lived to regret writing off, and every one of them is worth the time it takes to tell.